Now we're back with our panoramas, and this time it's an incredible sunrise in New Zealand, which I captured last year. And let's have a look at the files that we've got. So here's the darkest exposure from the tile furthest to the right. Here's the brighter exposure. Here's the darkest exposure from the middle tile, and here's the brightest exposure. And here's the darkest exposure from the left tile. And here is the brightest exposure. So we have 3 tiles and 2 exposures for each tile to work with. Now I want to show you the alternative way to blend panoramas and why I don't really like it very much. I'm going to select all 3 of the bright exposures, click on this drop down menu and choose Merge to Panorama. Now I think this was only added in Photoshop CC. I can't really remember. So if you're watching this and you're using CS6, you don't really need to worry about this. Now we've created our panorama, we can press Merge and we can save it. And the plus point about this is that we can actually work with smart objects when we're using this technique. So we can still play with the raw files and we have full access to Adobe Camera Raw. It just doesn't work as well as individually blending the tiles. So now we're going to select all the darker exposures and do exactly the same thing. Merge to Panorama. And when we're ready, we just press Merge and save. Now we're not going to do anything with the sliders here. I just want to open up these files in Photoshop. And then I'll stack them. And you'll see that once we stack them, they look reasonably aligned, but there is movement between the exposures. So if I choose difference and I zoom in to the image, you can see there's definitely movement. So if I choose the Move tool and I use my arrow keys and my keyboard to try and correct that, let's see, we just zoom down a little bit. And now you can see this mountain here is nicely aligned. But when we scroll across to other parts of the image, you'll see the mountains to the right aren't aligned, the trees aren't aligned, and the mountains to the left aren't aligned either. So this isn't going to give us a very smooth stitch. Now, if I change the blend mode to normal, we can try and align the layers. So I'm going to select both the layers and choose Edit, Auto Align Layers. Now, if this works, you can just carry on blending exposures as you normally would. But if we zoom in to the mountain again, we can see there's still significant movement. And once more, I'll choose Difference, select the Move tool, and try and align them up manually. But again, the mountains are misaligned. And it looks like Photoshop hasn't really done anything with that auto aligning. So as you can see, this isn't necessarily the best way to stitch a panorama. And the reason for that is, as I explained earlier, there's different information between these tiles. You see, Photoshop reads these exposures, it finds common points, and then Photoshop stitches it slightly differently, and hence the misalignment. So let's go back to the raw files and create the panorama the way we've just seen with the cityscape. So I'm going to select all of my exposures and I'm just going to bring them into Photoshop. First things first, let's select them all. And I'm going to remove chromatic aberration and enable lens profile corrections. And all I'm going to do with this darker exposure is bring up the shadows just a little bit. We're just doing a little bit of matching here. Now I realize I've actually got the brighter exposures selected here. So actually I'm going to default that, so undo everything. And I'm going to select the darker exposures and do that again. So I'm just brightening up the shadows a tiny bit, maybe even bringing down the highlights a tiny bit. Now with the brighter exposures, that's actually pretty good. We don't need to worry about that. I think that's going to give us a good selection in our mask in the sky because it's nice and bright. So I'm going to select all of these and I'm going to open them in Photoshop just as normal images because we can't stitch smart objects. So we've got all of our exposures in Photoshop and I'm going to start blending them one by one. And so I'm going to take you through the first one and I'm not going to remove any distortion. I'm just going to blend the exposures. So I'm going to put the darkest exposure on top, make it invisible, and let's do it with the actions now. And we're going to choose Dark Exposure Luminosity Mask and press play. And now I'm probably just going to leave the image like this. It seems like a pretty good mask with enough contrast between the shadows and the highlights. And just press OK. And hold down Control or Command on a Mac and left click on the thumbnail of the temp mask. And now I'm going to select my white brush, press Command and H and bring my opacity to 100%. You're probably going to be sick of me saying this now. I've said it so many times. and I'm just going to paint in the sky. And I'm going to bring it down into the foreground too, just to restore some of those highlights in the beautiful reflection. And let's do the sky again. I don't want to do the reflection again because I think there's enough information there. But we can still bring out some more of that beautiful sky. That looks fantastic. And now we can delete this temp mask and press Command and D or Control and D to deselect our active selection. And let's just make sure everything's nicely blended. We haven't got any edging along the mountains or along the trees, so that looks pretty good. So I'm going to save this as a PSD file. In my folder, just press Save, so that's called 1A. Now I'm going to do the same with the next tile. So I'm going to take the darker exposure, I'm going to drag it, put it on, and I'm going to blend these exposures just exactly the same way that I did previously. So again, I'm going to speed this up until it comes to the actual stitching of the panorama. So going from right to left, I've already blended these exposures. This is the right tile, this is the center tile, and this is the left tile. And I've saved them all, so now it's just a matter of stitching them. So just as we did previously, I'm going to go to File, Automate, Photo Merge, Add Open Files, and OK. And Photoshop has finished stitching the panorama, so I'm going to close these windows. We don't need them open anymore. And it looks like Photoshop's done a pretty good job. Doesn't seem to be any edging or mismatch in terms of colors or any bad stitching with the clouds. So if we're happy with that, I'm going to go to Layer and Merge Visible. Now remember at the beginning of the video, I talked about flattening our subjects when we use a really wide angle. In this photo, I could have easily switched my camera from landscape to portrait, used a larger focal distance and captured more tiles, maybe 6 or 7 tiles quickly. But we've had relatively quick moving clouds here, and I needed to capture the exposures quite quickly, which is why they're shot at a relatively high ISO. So I basically shot 3 tiles instead of 7 just so I could get the consistency in the cloud movement. And the result of that are flat hills and flat trees, but which we can correct quite easily. And to do that, we've done something similar before when we've been correcting distortion. Now we can press Command and T or Control and T, right click and go to Distort. And all I'm going to do is just bring up these areas here. And we're just stretching out the exposure. And if we're happy, we can press OK. Now, we could probably just leave it here and it would still be a decent shot. We've got a little bit of symmetry going along these mountains, and then with these trees here, and in the middle we've got a little mountain. We've got a fantastic sunrise and a really good reflection too. So if you want to keep your shot natural, you can ignore the next bit completely. But I want to see if we can deepen the mood slightly by making our subjects bigger. And by subjects, I really mean this central subject here, this mountain. But again, if you want to keep your image more natural, you don't need to do this at all. I'm not sure which one I prefer, but I'm going to do it anyway in this video, just as a new technique that you might not have seen before. So I'm going to hold down Control and T or Command and T on a Mac. I'm going to right click and choose Warp. And then I'm going to select just above this mountain and just drag it upwards, all the way up. I'm just going to keep going, and it doesn't matter if the clouds disappear. And then I'm going to take roughly the same area below the mountain and I'm going to drag that down. And I'm going to do the same again and the same again. And you see we're stretching it out each time. And I'm going to keep bringing it down up to about there. Now the problem with that is, of course, we've created some distortion here in the trees and in the mountain. We've made them quite long and distorted. So again, if this isn't for you, if it doesn't look very natural, well then you don't need to do this at all. You can skip this step. But I'm going to continue to stretch these out along here just a little bit, just so it looks a bit more natural. Now the great thing about this scene is we don't have a naturally flat horizon. We have this area here which isn't straight, it curves in, and we have a little bit of a straight line here. And if we were working with buildings or something with a definitive horizon, we'd be able to see a lot of different curves and problems with this warp tool. But we're not working with anything like that, so we should be okay to be flexible in what we can do here. Now be warned that the more we do this, the more we degrade our image. So basically we soften the details a little bit. We take away some of its sharpness. So what I'm sacrificing here is sharpness for mood. And sometimes I will go for mood ahead of everything else, because the first thing you see when you see an image, or the first thing you do, is you incorporate or try to understand the mood of the image. And we do that unconsciously. So that for me almost always takes precedence. Now again, I'm not sure if I prefer this image to just the normal one that we had before the warp, but it's a good technique for us to look at. So once we're happy with this, we can press OK. So here is the before and there is the after. And I think that is actually pretty good. So I'm going to crop in these areas because we don't need it. We don't need that little bit of the jetty there. And I'm going to crop just down a little bit. I want to keep some of this clouds, you see where it curves around. I think that's very important in the frame. So I'm just going to crop down just a little bit and press OK. And now when we have little bits like this, again, we can press Command and T, right click and choose Warp. And then we just drag the bottom part of the image here. And I'm going to drag the top part of the image here. And you see we're just pulling them out a little bit. Then we press OK. So now we've got a really striking image here. But the first thing I want to do, I'm going to make some contrast adjustments, but I want to make sure this area in the sun doesn't become overexposed. So to do that, I'm going to go to our actions and I'm going to go to highlights, D and B. And I'm going to bring the slider all the way along, the mid-tone slider and then the highlight slider. And I'm just trying to make a selection here of the brightest parts of the image. Press OK when I'm happy. Now with the layer selected, I'm going to set my foreground to black and I'm just going to paint in that area. And you see we've brought back some of that color. It's obviously far too strong, so I'm going to bring down the opacity of that layer all the way to around, let's say 20%. So there you go, we've brought back a little bit of color. So I'm going to put that at 27%. So now it's time for some contrast adjustments. I'm going to open up this levels layer and I'm going to give our image a little bit of brightness and kick. And of course, I'm going to bring down the midtones and I'm going to do what I usually do and bring up the output levels in the slider here so that we're softening the contrast and making a softer, more intimate scene. And I think that's probably about right. And why not create a little Orton effect too, just to add a little bit more magic to the scene. So Raya Pro users, of course, you can go to enhancements and Orton effect, and that will give us a nice, dreamy, soft Orton. Then we can bring down the opacity to around 12%. See, we're just softening the image. And if you can't see that on your video, let me just zoom into this area here. There's before and after. So we're just softening the image a little bit. For non-Raya Pro users, we're going to hold down Control, Alt, Shift and E, or Command, Option, Shift and E. Set our opacity, let's say, to around 26%. Go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and press OK. And if we want, we can press Command and L or Control and L to bring up the levels dialog, and we can slide that along just to brighten it up a little bit. Press OK, and then we can bring down the opacity to around, let's say, 10%. There we go. In fact, I think that's probably a little bit too strong. So let's say closer to around 8%, 7%. And that's a little bit nicer. Now, because we've been pushing and pulling this raw file, and because we shot at a relatively high ISO, you'll see these trees are a little bit soft and blurry. So I'm going to sharpen these trees. Now, usually I don't sharpen my full-size images. I only sharpen my images for the web, because often I'm shooting with a tripod like this, and most images are extremely sharp without sharpening. I often find that a lot of images online are simply over sharpened. But in this case, I'm going to sharpen just around these trees here. And I'm going to do that by holding Control, Alt, Shift and E, or Command, Option, Shift and E. And I'm going to convert that to a smart object. so that we can come back and undo any changes we might want to do. Then I'm going to go to Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask, and I'm just going to select this area. So we want to sharpen this area. And this is before, so we've got amount 1%. And if I bring it all the way up, let's say to around 500, you can see we've added a lot of local contrast and sharpened it quite a bit. Now the reason why it doesn't look too strong is because the radius is quite small. If we brought the radius up, you see it would be a little bit over exaggerated. So if I put the radius down to 1 and bring the amount up to, let's say 320, and press OK, I can hold down Alt or Option on a Mac and create a black mask. And then I can take my paintbrush with a white foreground at 100% opacity, change my brush size and just paint in that sharpened layer. Now if you can't see the effect it's having, I'll zoom in a second and you can see the difference. I'm just painting in these trees here, just giving them a bit more definition, a little bit more sharpness. So now let's zoom in and look at these trees here. Now we're zoomed in 180% by the way, so this shouldn't be very sharp in the first place. So here's before and after. And you see we've just sharpened up those areas. It looks a lot better. Now just in case we've missed some areas, I'm going to paint in around here. And that should just about do it. So there's the before and after. You can't see a huge difference on the full size image, but actually it does make a difference when you zoom in. And at 100%, there's the before and after, and that's a huge difference. Now, even though these clouds are really dramatic, I want to add some more drama to them and to the reflection as well. So to add a little bit more emphasis, we're going to do something we've done a few more times, and I'm going to create that merged layer holding Control, Shift, Alt and E, or Command, Shift, Option, E. Then I can change this to a Smart Object 2. And now I'm going to open up Filter, Adobe Camera Raw Filter, and I'm going to bring up the clarity. And you see we're adding some fantastic contrast to those clouds. And when we're done, we can press OK. And now I create a mask on that layer, and I'm just going to mask out the foreground because that's going to create edging if we're not careful. So I'm just going to mask out some of the foreground here. So here's the before and after. It's added some fantastic drama to the sky, and I'm just going to bring down the opacity a tiny bit just so it's not too much. And now I feel like the mountains to the left are a little bit bright compared to the trees to the right. So the contrast is just a little bit too soft. So I'm going to open up a levels layer, and I'm going to bring the shadows dialog down. And then I'm going to press Command and I or Control and I to make the mask invisible. And I'm just going to paint in at 100% this half of the image. Because where these clouds divide the scene is where it seems to darken, which looks quite cool. We have a lighter part on the left and then a darker part on the right, but actually it's offering a little bit too much imbalance. So I'm just equaling out a little bit the contrast there. Now I'd like to brighten up the mist on the horizon here just a little bit. So I'm going to open up another levels layer. I'm going to bring the highlights up, and I'm going to press Command and I just as I've done before. So we're just manually making small contrast adjustments here and there. Here's the mist. And now we don't want it to be too surreal. It doesn't make sense that this would be extremely bright while other things around it are a little bit darker. So I want to bring down the opacity a little bit just to make it look a bit more natural. And now I think we need another contrast adjustment just to brighten up the scene a bit more because it's all a little bit dark. Perhaps bring these shadows in a tiny bit. And there's the before and after. And I think the highlights are a little bit overexposed now. So I'm going to choose a black paintbrush and just paint out those really bright areas. And I can probably do the same here too. Just manually painting them out. Now there's a cone here floating in the water, so I'm going to zoom in to that area. I'm going to take my clone stamp, clone just to the right of it, and just clone it out. That's easy enough. Then I'm going to zoom out. And as you may have noticed, when we're zooming in and out, we do have a little bit of noise from the ISO that I shot at. Now, for me, that's neither here nor there. It's just a little bit of grain. I would definitely leave that in. I really don't think it makes a big difference to the scene, and I'm certainly not a pixel peeper. But if you want to reduce that noise, of course, we can merge our layers just like we've done before. Again, we can turn this into a smart object, just in case we want to undo whatever we're going to do. Then we can go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, zoom into one of these areas in the sky, bring the radius all the way down, and we're just looking to move it along until the noise has disappeared. So that looks like around 4 did the job. And then of course, I'm going to create a white mask, paintbrush with a black foreground, 100% opacity, and I'm going to paint out the mountains. So we don't have to worry about the water because naturally that's blurry, so it's okay if all of the Gaussian blur is applied to the water. So there you go, we are just masking out the noise removal layer. So let's just have a look at the mask just to make sure we haven't missed anything. I think that's okay. Maybe just a little bit to the left here. So now if we zoom in, this is the before and this is after. And I think the clouds have become a little bit too blurry there. So I'm going to bring the opacity, even if it introduces a bit of noise, it doesn't matter too much. And now if we're doing this correctly, we should go around with a small brush, small white brush, and just start painting in these areas here. Now again, I don't really think the noise removal was necessary, so I'm going to remove that layer. To finish, I'm going to actually bring down some of the colors in this scene because they're just too strong. So I've opened up a saturation layer there, and I'm just bringing it down a tiny bit, not too much. And now we're going to create a vignette, my favorite type of vignette. So I'm going to open up a curves layer. I'm going to bring down the midtones, bring up the shadows a tiny bit, press Command and I or Control and I to make that invisible, create a large brush at 100% opacity, and I'm going to paint in around the image. Now I don't want to paint on these trees because they're already a bit dark, but I can paint in the sky here. And I don't want to paint on the mist because we have a little dark patch here. It'll look not very natural. So that's before and after. And now I want to brighten up the horizon just a little bit. So I'm going to press Command and J or Control and J to duplicate that layer. Press Command and I to invert the mask. Then I'm going to open up the curves layer and I'm going to bring up the highlights. Bring up the highlights here, but also bring down the lower midtones. And I'll just have a quick look before and after. And I think that looks quite good, if not a little bit too strong. So I'm going to reduce the opacity a little bit. And then I'm going to take my brush with a black foreground and I'm going to paint out this area in the sky where it's overexposed a little bit. And so here is before and after. We have a really open scene, but we want to push the viewer more towards these mountains. And with the vignette, we've darkened around the image and brightened up the center of it to do just that. So here's before and after, before and after. And I love doing that vignette. And so that's it for our panorama tutorial. And as you can see, blending the tiles individually and then stitching the panorama is usually more effective than stitching the panorama for each individual exposure and then blending.